Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jacquie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're turning our attention to Syria, and we're happy to be joined for this conversation by independent journalist Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And, Vanessa, you're on the ground in Damascus, and I'm just sort of curious, what are conditions like, on the ground? What have been some of the most recent developments within the Syrian conflict, and how have things been playing out from your vantage point?
Well, I was actually in the liberated areas of southern Idlib and West Aleppo last week. And in fact, I visited Sarakeb, which is the city at the junction of the M5 highway and the M4 highway. The M5 takes you from Aleppo to Damascus, and the M4 from Sarakeb to Latakia on the coast. And at this point, the Syrian Arab Army had just taken or liberated Sarakeb from the Al-Qaeda-dominated armed factions in that area in Idlib. And the terrorist groups, as I said, led by Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as they're now rebranded, were preparing for a counterattack. So during the day that I was working there, we received around 40 missiles from the terrorist groups that had been pushed back to some degree from Sarakeb, liberating the M5 motorway, which at that point was free for civilian traffic to go from Damascus to Aleppo. In the next couple of days, Sarakeb was recaptured by the terrorist groups, and then over the next few days, it was taken back by the Syrian Arab Army. And this is the pattern of the military campaign, the Syrian Arab Army military campaign, alongside its allies from Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, to basically liberate the final province in the northwest from the terrorist occupation. When I'm talking about terrorist occupation, of course, people will start saying that these are the moderate rebels. Even American CENTCOM spokespeople in the last few weeks have admitted that this area is dominated by Al-Qaeda, and that Al-Qaeda factions or affiliates are causing the most civilian suffering and damage in these areas, and certainly causing much of the so-called refugee crisis, which Turkey is using to blackmail the EU. In the past few days, of course, we've had the meeting between President Putin and Erdogan, and we've had the ceasefire put in place, which effectively Erdogan was pushing and using military aggression to try and maintain the territory that was agreed during the Sochi talks and previously in Astana, of course, which Erdogan himself violated. He was supposed to ensure that the armed groups or that the terrorist groups withdrew from these areas, withdrew their heavy weapons. In reality, what happened is Turkey was reinforcing those groups, reinforcing the groups that were staying in the deconfliction zones and supplying them with heavy weapons and equipment, and setting up Turkish military points there also. So now the ceasefire ensures that the M4 has a buffer zone either side. So effectively the M4 is under control of Russian patrols who have agreed to patrol with Turkish vehicles. The M5 is open again, Aleppo to Damascus. And the Syrian Arab Army have sustained or let's say, ensured the areas that they had already liberated will remain under their control, and that they continue advancing against the terrorist groups. So this ceasefire benefits Syria way more than it benefits Turkey. This was a masterful negotiation by Russia, which of course the UN Security Council has not accepted as a peaceful resolution to the escalating conflict in Idlib.
Yeah, and I was hoping you could say more about that, about the ceasefire between Russia and Turkey, and how that's been playing out for Turkey. Obviously, it was some kind of agreement or something needed to happen, because things seems as though it would have basically continued to have escalated between Russia and Turkey had that not happened. And I'm just wondering how you've been seeing the sort of ceasefire reality play out there.
I think, first of all, it's very important to state, although the discussions went on between Erdogan and Putin, the ceasefire agreement would not have been put into place without the agreement of Damascus government with Putin. So that's a very important point to make, because generally people are trying to portray the idea that Russia is controlling the conflict. This isn't true. Russia does work in partnership with Damascus, particularly over major deals like this. But yeah, effectively, before the ceasefire came into place, and I was in Idlib at this time, the Syrian Arab Army was coming under attack by Turkish drones, UAVs, that were attacking the front lines of the Syrian Arab Army as they were battling Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. So clearly what we saw was a coordination, which we've seen throughout this conflict, between Erdogan and the terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, that have been occupying Idlib, and previously, of course, were occupying suburbs of eastern Aleppo, western Aleppo, in fact, surrounding the city of Aleppo. Those have also been pushed back. Of course, Erdogan's ambition was to have control of Aleppo. His terrorist proxies have conducted industrial theft on a massive scale from Aleppo, from Idlib, breaking down essential infrastructure like electrical power grids, factories, water plants, and re-establishing those elements inside Turkey's borders. So the Turkish aggression, which was a violation of international law, Turkey is a NATO member state. The fact that this aggression was not condemned, Turkey invaded Syria's sovereign territory with Turkish military. So it wasn't only using the terrorist proxies that I've mentioned, it was using its own military. It was setting up around now 49 or 50 military bases. I photographed at least 4 or 5 of them at the time that I was inside Idlib, that had been hastily set up as military points inside Idlib that were being used, for example, to target Syrian warplanes, Russian warplanes, with American-supplied tow missiles that were being fired by the terrorist groups, but from these Turkish military centers. So the coordination and collaboration between Turkey and the terrorist groups was very clear. But not only that, the coordination between Turkey and Israel was also very clear. As the Syrian Arab Army was advancing and Turkey was using its UAVs to target the army, Israel was equally targeting areas of, for example, Homs, where there is a military airbase that has air defense missiles. This was targeted by Israel during this attack by Turkey. So clearly we've seen throughout this Idlib campaign a clear coordination between not only a NATO member state, Turkey, and the terrorist groups, but also between Turkey and Israel. So therefore Israel is de facto supporting the terrorist groups that are fighting alongside Turkey. So we have an extraordinary situation here where, as I keep saying, a NATO member state has violated international law. It's violated Syrian airspace and territory. It has invaded. And therefore, Russia's role was to try and, let's say, put a lid on this aggression and to try and redirect it. And of course, that's what they've achieved. How Erdogan behaves going forward, we will wait and see. Certainly, there's not a huge amount of trust in his word. I mean, he defaulted on the Sochi agreement, and it's very likely we've seen a number of convoys of Turkish vehicles entering Idlib now and heading to the south. We presume on the basis that he will be going to patrol the M4 as agreed with Russia, but nobody trusts Erdogan and nobody trusts him not to be reinforcing and re-equipping the terrorist groups that at the moment are kind of being held at bay. Of course, the terrorist groups now have also broken the ceasefire, I think, more than 10 times according to the Russian monitoring of the situation. And the Syrian Arab Army, of course, has reserved the right to keep advancing, to keep liberating areas from the terrorist occupation.
Vanessa, you brought up the fact that nobody trusts Erdogan to keep his word. I'm wondering what the sense is among the people who are obviously caught in the middle of this horrendous conflict between all of these forces. And it's definitely a tenuous ceasefire at best. But what has been your sense of the mood among the people who are trapped in between these forces. What are they? Are they hopeful? Are they just as mistrustful that the ceasefire will not hold? And where do they turn for, any kind of relief for them?
Well, I think one very important point to make here is that the Syrian Arab Army would not have been able to advance as quickly and as efficiently as it did without cooperation from Syrian civilians in Idlib, who were providing intelligence information on, for example, the terrorist positions, on, for example, the potential of staged chemical attacks. We've seen yourselves at Sputnik, reporting on potential for staged chemical attacks during this campaign, which of course is a standard pattern as the Syrian army advances in various areas in Syria towards liberation of those areas from the terrorist occupation. So it's very important to make this point that there is a big collaboration between Syrian civilians who, as you rightly say, are trapped in this conflict, trapped and being used by the terrorist groups as human shields, being used to blackmail the Syrian Arab Army, basically to stop their advances. The Syrian army and Russia, of course, have been providing consistently humanitarian corridors for these civilians to be able to leave to the safety of government-secured areas. Many civilians have managed to leave, but of course, again, what the terrorists are doing are shelling or mining these humanitarian corridors to prevent civilians leaving because, as I've said, they have huge value to the terrorist groups as human shields. Some of the civilians have fled to the north. Now, among those, we would have to say there are some that had no choice. They couldn't use the humanitarian corridors, so they fled in the only direction they could, which was northwards towards Turkey. Some of those will be families of the terrorist group fighters. Some will be those who we know in any sort of occupation situation, there will be collaborators. There will be people who perhaps have been indoctrinated by or radicalized over a 9-year occupation of their homes and villages by these extremist groups. So, it's a very complex situation. People in the West, particularly the media in the West, has a tendency to reduce the arguments down to sort of bad Assad, good rebels, and to ignore these nuances and these complexities of this conflict. But the majority of people in Idlib, and that includes those who had already fled in 2015, for example, when the terrorist groups took over Idlib city, Jisr al-Shugur, and other areas of Idlib, they are desperate for the Syrian Arab Army to liberate these areas so that they can return home. And of course, as we always see, as areas are liberated, civilians are returning home. They're returning home, trying to rebuild, trying to restore. We're seeing that in West Aleppo already. As soon as the areas are demined by the Syrian and Russian sappers, then people can safely return home and start to rebuild and restore. And this is the familiar pattern that we've seen throughout Syria.
Yeah, Vanessa, I appreciate you clarifying the role of civilians in this conflict. I feel like we basically never hear about that. And I'm also wondering about the potential role of other world powers in this conflict. Specifically, I saw it was reported that a soldier from Britain's SAS, the Special Air Services, was found, I believe, wounded by an IED explosion in Syria. I was hoping you could talk about that and maybe explain why that may be significant.
Yeah, and this is my analysis,
right,
based on what I'm seeing here. What we've seen recently in the south, for example, is a spate of IED car explosions in Damascus, which we hadn't seen previously. We've seen very recently an Iranian Quds Forces commander assassinated in Sayyida Zainab. Now, Sayyida Zainab is an area of pilgrimage for Shia Muslims in the center of Damascus, and he was assassinated. We've seen the Syrian Arab Army campaign against a pocket of, let's say, extremist groups that were armed and still carrying out violent acts in an area of Dara. They have now been bussed up to Idlib to join their colleagues there. But there is talk of renewed unrest in Dara and in the southern area. And of course, this southern area touches on the southeastern area, which still has the US military base, Al Tanf, and to the south of Al-Tanaf, Rukban camp, which we know to be basically a recruitment training center for ISIS and other extremist groups. So what I believe, I mean, it's fascinating that this report was even published, that this SAS operative, who, as you rightly say, was wounded apparently by an IED, will be part of maybe a new intelligence clandestine destabilization campaign. Effectively, the US coalition has lost the military campaign to topple the Syrian government, but that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that they're going to give up. And what we're now possibly going to see is this sort of low-intensity intelligence campaign, IED explosions in the capital city, further fomenting of unrest and anti-government reactionaries in Dara, for example, which was kind of the launch of the so-called revolution against the Syrian government, and potentially the releasing of ISIS operatives again into the Badia Desert in the southeast, coming into Palmyra and Homs and carrying out isolated attacks either against civilians or Syrian Arab Army positions here. As I said, this is my speculation and my analysis, but so far it's sort of bearing out. And I think the fact that this SAS or operative, was taken immediately to Al-Tanaf, the American military base, as I've mentioned, and then on to Iraq for medical care. This suggests that there's this coordination between the American military base and British intelligence working in the south. And of course, that will then connect into Israel, who has been arming and offering medical treatment to the armed groups in the south. So I think it's in the interest of the US coalition to maintain this low-intensity destabilization of Syria, even if it has lost the high-intensity war and it's seeing Idlib province being returned to Syrian government control.
Yeah, a couple minutes left, Vanessa, and I wanted to talk about the issue of narrative and consciousness around the Syria conflict and how people who are going against that narrative you spoke of earlier of Assad bad, rebels good, facing a kind of suppression, on social media and elsewhere. How have you been seeing that manifest?
Well, I mean, speaking personally, I've come under attack for the last 2 years systematically by mainstream media, by all manner of methods, really, to discredit. And of course, this is the Israel lobby method in order to discredit the message, you have to discredit the messenger. And that's what effectively all of these state-aligned media outlets have been doing, is to try to discredit the evidence that I'm presenting by discrediting the messenger. But unfortunately for them, the thing is that this war against Syria has gone on for 10 years. That's twice as long as the Second World War. And their propaganda has not evolved. It's basically retained its reductionist element. As I said, Assad bad, rebels good. And people are seeing through it. Public consensus since the liberation of Aleppo in 2016 has started to dramatically shift towards accepting and at least investigating the alternative and diverging views on Syria. And unfortunately, actually, their campaign, in my opinion, has backfired because people are seeing the lack of evolution in their narrative. They're seeing that it's not updating itself as new evidence appears. And while we are presenting new evidence on a daily basis, they are maintaining this sort of low-level humanitarian war consent manufacturing narrative, which doesn't age very well, basically. So yes, we are under attack, but I believe that public consensus has shifted dramatically towards at least a middle ground, but I think even more towards the fact that, effectively Syria is defending itself against a proxy invasion financed, equipped and armed by up to 80 hostile states, which are led by the US, the UK and the EU, and of course supported by Turkey, the Gulf states and Israel. And I think public sympathy for Syria in its battle against what is effectively an imperialist project is increasing.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa Beeley, for helping us parse through these issues in the Syrian conflict. We're going to leave it there and move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., but we will be back. So please